Hey everyone, I am just putting up a little bit of information, trying to do things a little differently this quarter with our online or remote learning format. Today's presentation is really just to get us thinking about some of the concepts around death and dying, and specifically to get you thinking about what I'm asking you to do in your first assignment. So there are a couple things we're going to look at in this class. Overall, there's a lot of different ways for us to discuss death and dying. And from a healthcare perspective and as a nursing elective, there's certainly a lot of the biochemical piece, the palliative care, symptom management, hospice care, and some of the clinical aspects of this. And we will touch on some of that. But a lot of what I want us to actually dig into in this quarter, in this class, is really how do we straddle the worlds from our medical culture, from our social structures, and then just also as human beings who may be struggling with death and dying, either in the past or currently, or certainly in the future in our own lives. So I am much more curious about the dynamic and the interplay of all of those different roles and hats that we wear in terms of death and dying than necessarily all of the technical pieces, which many of you will have had exposure to if you've done rotations or if some of you actually work in hospice or end-of-life care. And as this quarter goes, if you have personal experiences that you're willing to share, especially when we do our asynchronous class meetings, those are obviously going to be optional, but those are times where I really would love for us to get together and just have discussions. I'll also arrange some guest speakers over the course of the quarter. So summer's always challenging with guest speakers and travel plans, and a pandemic. So scheduling guest speakers has been challenging, to say the least. So we'll get some of that squared away when the time's right. And I'll keep you abreast of that, of when we're going to have guest speakers, what the topic's going to be on, and invite you to join us for those discussions. But those are the stories that if you have experiences, stories, really things that have shifted your perspective, or in the course of those discussions, your perspective's shifting, that's the kind of stuff that I invite into this class. None of us are experts in this, and certainly what lays beyond. So I really want this to be a joint learning experience and a joint experiment, really, in what we're doing here. So why are we talking about it? I mean, honestly, as people in healthcare, most of you are nursing students, and some of you are also in the health studies program or other programs, but healthcare oriented. We're in the business of life. I mean, if you think about it and think about what our healthcare system and what our healthcare and medical training is predicated upon, is the preservation, maintenance of life as our primary goal. However, at the same time, when you are in the business of life, you are also in the business of death. And I think that this has always been acutely true for me in clinical practice, just being involved in perinatal care, and specifically as a midwife, and literally working, hundreds and thousands of times on that threshold of life, and also being really clear that is not only a threshold but a precipice, and it goes very distinctly and sharply into one of two directions, and very quickly, in the way that babies and birthing parents transition really quickly into life following a birth. There's always the possibility that can go in the other direction. And having been privy to those experiences, but also just having that knowledge and always having to hold that in those clinical situations has made me very interested in this. I also just have lots of other personal experiences of losing my best friend and several other friends very quote unquote young. We'll talk a little bit about that and just how age and that concept of deserving to die plays into this too. But I am endlessly fascinated by the way that we tackle these topics, or rather that we don't. So that's partly why we're talking about it too. I think that also the other piece of why death and dying has started to take on just generally more interest in our population. We have the largest number of people in the baby boomer generation, so to speak, in the 65 plus generation that we've ever had before, who are living longer than they've ever had before, which means that they're also navigating living while also concurrently navigating the discussions around the concepts around dying. Which means that as healthcare providers and people in healthcare, you are also navigating that with them, that they are simultaneously living and dying at the same time. And we are not never, but very often more present to that near the end of our lives than we are in other parts, certainly than most of us were in our 20s or are. Definitely not as children, unless maybe we've had terminal illness or chronic illness that has actually had us face that much younger. Chronologically. And again, we'll come to the age thing later, because the way that age frames the conversation around death and dying is also fascinating to me. Being a person who works with perinatal populations and people losing babies during pregnancy and immediately after, and even sometime later, but while their children are still young, or potentially one of the parents dying, and how that influences all of these conversations. That so much of the resource and the discussion around death and dying is around as if we have made it to the end of our lives, we're having the opportunity to have discussions, and we have acknowledged that this is even a possibility or a thing that should happen. In addition to that, we are having a lot of conversations in our medical cultural context about autonomy, about right to life, and right to death, and death with dignity, and the concept of shared decision making, and justice in healthcare. And what's interesting is that in a lot of those conversations, other than death with dignity, death is often not considered an option. So even when we consider the concept of shared decision making, which I bring up a lot when I teach, is the idea that we are bringing all the information to the table. It is not a top-down conversation. It is not a unidirectional conversation. It's absolutely multi-directional and a lateral conversation. We are all on the same playing field, which is very, very much not often how it shows up in medicine. And we all know this. Hierarchy is absolutely present in our positions and in the way that we conduct medical care. Shared decision-making is really not a unique concept, but it is unique in the way that it plays out. And when we engage in shared decision-making, we still are coming at it from the premise of, I will give you all the information about how to preserve your life, all the different options. And then if you don't do this thing, you could die. And that's kind of like an after statement that we throw out there. But really, shared decision-making, if we're doing it very completely, we are also including not just if you don't do this thing, you could die. If you reject this treatment, you could die. Or something bad could happen. Like we end the conversation there. Literally, that should be the beginning of the conversation in shared decision making. Not only could you die, but here's what that actually could look like over this amount of time. These are the other decisions you would have to make about your dying, in addition to the decisions you'd have to make about your living. That would really ultimately be thorough shared decision making if we're doing it well. Think about how long that conversation would be. But also many of the reasons why we don't have it, not just simply because of the length or the convenience, but also that we still operate with the premise that life is the goal. Where are you positioned? So I really want you to think about all of the different hats and roles you wear as we move through this entire quarter, whether this is as a healthcare providing or an aspirant. If you're a human being who's living and will eventually die and considering your own death, this class will bring up all of that kind of stuff, the conversations you've had, the conversations you don't have. And how do your roles exist concurrently? Maybe the value systems of how you operate as a human being and how you operate as a professional are a good match, but maybe they're not. And how is that operationalized for you? How is that dissonant? What does that do for you? And does it make you, as a healthcare provider, avoid certain conversations, make us avoid very thorough and complete shared decision making, or not? So thinking about where we are in that equation as ourselves too, with the myriad of roles that we inhabit. My dad is fond of saying, I have this quote in here, death is a biochemical process, no more nor less. He's nostalgic about a lot of things, but he is not nostalgic about this. And we talk about death in our family very often. So just to give you that context of why there's also a certain level of comfort and interest for me, as your instructor and as someone who is wanting to help you navigate this conversation or at least walk through it with you. Is that we've been having this conversation in our family very actively, like on a regular basis, almost weekly, certainly monthly, for over 20 years. So I was probably in my mid-20s at the time. My sister was like, maybe around 23 or so. And my parents were just, we were on our way, so to speak, living our lives, doing our thing. And my parents were traveling a lot. 5 and 6 times a year for long trips, going to different places, nothing super dangerous, but definitely feeling like this was the time for them if they didn't do it when, and they were still quite young. They were only in their late 40s, early 50s, really. So they literally sat down with us and started having this conversation. This is what's going to happen to us. It might happen to us on one of these trips. There's the legal financial planning piece. This is who you call. This is my attorney. These are the bank accounts. This is the safety deposit box key, things like that. Logistic stuff. Sell the house. You both make decisions together. If you can't agree, you get to make them. But stuff that also makes it really, really important when someone dies to not have to figure out then. So having had to do that in a number of different situations, I absolutely appreciate that we have these conversations. But I'm really curious what you guys think about, death being a biochemical process and being very not nostalgic or deeply emotional about the event itself, but more the dying. Very often death has a really bleak look to it. And because of that bleakness or darkness, we ignore all of the lead up to it, because it seems like walking into darkness. Why would we do that on purpose? And really, there is an incredible amount of beauty in the process of dying, because you're also still living. That is incredibly beautiful, and we miss that because of our approach specifically to the event of death, either it being strictly biochemical or dark or bleak or just nothingness altogether. I want you to think about how it influences the way you live, the way you care for others. And also thinking about then those ingrained, ingested beliefs and how does it influence the way our healthcare system positions death in the scope of medicine as something bleak. So maybe we just don't address it. We just don't have those conversations in shared decision making. We don't have those conversations with our families when we're sitting with them, except for maybe if you work, second or third shift and you're sitting there late at night with people. And I feel like this is when I've had all my conversations, because midwifery is always third shift. And this is when you get into the stuff with people about what do they really want and where do they position death in their own lives as something beautiful, as something dark, as something beautiful, as something to be ignored, or as a medical event to be managed. And how does our belief around that then adjust the way that we do everything, the way that we live, the way that we treat other human beings, the way we care for them in healthcare, the policies and the legal and the social cultural constructs that actually get developed around that belief system. So I want to dig into all of that. And then how does that contribute to injustice, inequity? So we're going to also get to this, we're going to get to a point this quarter where we're discussing value of life. That there are some lives that we value more than others. And that influences our conversation on this. That maybe we don't value 90-year-old lives as much as we value 50-year-old lives. And certainly not as much as we value 5-year-old lives. And that in and of itself influences the conversation. And that we are very ill-equipped to have those conversations around 5-year-old, but on some level also equally ill-equipped to have the conversation around 90-year-olds, because that's just a foregone conclusion, 5-year-olds not. Thinking about whether or not people are good people and they deserve to die. I mean, I'll say very explicitly, these conversations that are coming up around police brutality and people being murdered by our police force in this country on a regular basis, and it has been true for generations. What happens? People bring up their record. They deserve to die. Think about how often that happens in healthcare. How often we allow the inequities and disparities that affect people in their living to also affect the way that they die. We're going to talk about that. And that's very, very uncomfortable. It's one thing to break down implicit bias and the way that we care for people in our care, in our preservation of their life, or maybe our slightly less attentive care. But the fact that we let them die in our care, that we sometimes kill them in our care, is something that we are not often equipped to discuss and handle, and we're going to talk about that. We see that a lot in perinatal health in terms of mortality, morbidity, and I'll talk a little bit more about my experience with that and the maternal mortality and morbidity review board in Washington State. So and these are places that I want you to think about your own experiences, and even if you don't share, like, yeah, I did this thing and I let this person die. I fully understand that there's other issues there of shame and liability, but know that we've all contributed to that in some way, because we contribute to the system that does this on a regular basis, and so we have to dig into that. So we have to talk about it. I mean, it's going to happen, plain and simple, to every single one of us. And so the sooner we start these conversations, like anything else that's difficult and heart-wrenching and grief-striking, the sooner we bring it to light, the sooner those wounds can heal. Someone, I don't know where I read this, like some meme, talked about how wounds, like our skin wounds, like by exposing them to air, we start the healing process. Platelets, lymphocytes, neutrophils, everything comes to that site, not wholly with exposure to air, but very often it's that oxygen shift, it's the exposure to other chemicals in our air that actually helps stimulate the healing process, in part, not fully. The same is true for us. The same is true for our wounds on the inside, that if we speak them out, they have the opportunity to heal. And death and dying is one of those things that tends to live in here. We know what's going to happen. Maybe we live in fear of it every single day, and it actually dictates the way we live every other moment before that, or it dictates the way that we provide care to human beings because we're so afraid of that thing. But maybe if we speak it, there's that opportunity to change the way we live, or to change the way that we offer care to people in our healthcare system, to change the policies and the procedures and the medical legal context that surrounds that and supports that system. But it won't happen unless we talk about it. I also want us to think about, that conveyed value about life and death, that we value life over death, that we value some lives over others, and figuring out where we get that information from, who communicates it, talking about public health, and the way that we convey outcomes and outcomes for certain populations, and even that the nature of population health conveys risk and acceptability of death very differently. When we acknowledge, for instance, in population health, that there are certain groups in our society, like say, for instance, Black Americans and hypertension, that they are at quote unquote higher risk of having hypertensive disease and dying from complications of hypertensive disease. It's not just that we're acknowledging that this population may be at higher risk, might need more resources, have social dimensions of their health, but we're also saying that we are okay with them dying more from this thing. It's something for us to think about, what we're communicating, even from a public health standpoint, and how we're doing that. So what are we going to do? Because I like to think about what our action items are. I don't like to just, open the wound and not have a way to support the healing process, right? Because that's also, as we know, just in wound care and skin care, that's actually that's not helpful, and that actually can set us up for further complications or sepsis. So what are the changes we need to see, and where are given our positions, our myriad of positions, where do we think we can actually be agents of change? Where do we think that we can actually make an impact that is necessary, not just proceed with intention? And what are the consequences of that? So in the end, I want us to think about all of these different questions. I want you to start thinking about these questions. We're going to tackle a lot of stuff in this class, and it's a very short quarter, so we're going to do our best. And I encourage you at any point to reach out to me during this quarter, because what we are also digging into is not easy stuff. It brings up a lot for everybody. I own that one of the reasons that I'm also additionally, in addition to professionally interested in this topic, and just because of my family of origin, is that I lost my best friend, and sitting with her, and this is fairly recent, the last couple of years, and she died relatively quickly after her diagnosis, more quickly than we thought she was going to. And apologize, my phone. And the process of being with her through her dying, not her death, but her dying, was one of the most impactful things that I have ever been through in my entire life. And I have sat with thousands and thousands and thousands of patients and heard lots of stories. Have had my own very impactful and or traumatic experiences, and everything about her death and dying changed my life. So there is something deeply personal about this work, and so it may be true for you that there's something really deeply personal about what we're doing in this class. And I encourage you, if at any point you just need to say that to me, you need to reach out, you need support, you just need a phone call or a Zoom meeting, do that. The benefit of having this remote learning is that I'm sort of always available, and also simultaneously not, right? So, but I want you to know that I acknowledge that this is a thing that will create an opportunity for us to do work and confront some things that maybe we pushed aside. And I just want you to know that I'm here to be a resource to you. All right, let's get out of this thing. All right. So I'm going to put this on week 1 in the modules. It is there for you guys to watch. It's on Panopto, which is also on your left-hand side of Canvas. You should be able to link it there, but it will also be under your modules. And your first assignment is due next week. And hopefully this will help you at least start to be able to answer those questions, albeit for all of us completely and perfectly. So enjoy, actually, because this is, I don't know, I think it's going to be good. Take care.